welcome to episode 66 of the It's Just a Hill Cycling Podcast. I am John, and today I am here with John.
With John.
From NBX. John, welcome.
Thank you, John.
Thank you for coming to the show. We're here. We're going to talk about your history with working at a bike shop. We're going to talk about the bikes that you build, which I'm very excited to chat about. But before we get into that, let's talk about your history at NBX. You work on bikes here.
Yeah.
How long have you been working with NBX, for NBX, or maybe just like bike shops in general, if that's part of the journey?
I've been here, 9 years. I went by quickly. Yeah, 9 years. I started just about this time in 2015.
Yeah.
And here I am 9 years later. My career path is kind of convoluted.
Not always bikes?
Not always bikes.
Yep.
So I'll go back to the beginning of bikes. When I was just getting out of high school, I actually started working in casters up in Warwick.
Yes. I have casters jerseys at my house that my dad has given to me.
Yeah.
Yes, throughout the years.
Yeah, so I was there for about 5 or 6 years.
Okay.
And at that point, my career took a turn. Got out of the bike industry. If it's pertinent, I don't know. I moved to New Orleans.
Yeah, of course.
Because I just wanted
Just because you wanted to?
I wanted to move to New Orleans and check it out.
I love that.
So
this was like 5 years out of high school? You were like, I'm just going to go-ish?
Give or take,
Sure.
Yeah.
And you said, I just want to move to New Orleans.
Yeah.
Had you been to New Orleans before?
I hadn't. I mean, once I got the idea in my head, I made a brief exploratory trip.
Yep.
And I liked it. So I said, cool, I'm moving here.
Yes, I like that. Yep.
Yeah, so briefly when I moved down there, I don't know, approximating for maybe 6 months or so.
Yep.
I worked in a shop, but I had kind of burnt out on bikes for a while.
Sure.
Believe it or not. And I had this latent interest in photography.
Yep.
So this is kind of odd, but somehow or other, I saved up enough money not to work for like 4 or 5 months.
Oh, wow.
So I left the bike shop.
Yeah. This was from working at the bike shop. Were you doing other odd jobs, or was it just bike shop?
Just the bike shop.
Putting away the cash.
Yeah. And so I started studying up on photography on my own. And I just randomly went out to other photographers, said, you need help? And finally I found one. I replaced her darkroom person. It was still pre-digital.
Yep.
Actually, I started helping that darkroom person, but she kept making all these mistakes that I, the novice, was catching. So they got rid of that person. I took over.
Yeah.
Blah, blah, blah.
Before you were like, hey, I'm going to ask people if they need help, because I find this fascinating. You said you were doing research. What did that entail? Were you looking at photos? Were like you going to the library?
Well, I was studying photo art history just because I was interested in it.
Yeah.
But also the technical side of it, just getting books on darkroom work, chemistry, printing.
Right.
So I had absorbed a lot of the theoretical knowledge, and once I got into the darkroom with the help of this person who I ultimately replaced, I picked it up pretty quick.
Yeah.
So
how long? And then how long did you do that for? Was it just darkroom work, or were you going out and taking photos? Like
it was
a photo processing person. Like
I was processing her film and doing her printing.
Gotcha.
Yeah. And on the side for myself doing photography. I was never interested in commercial photography.
Okay.
I was always going to be an artiste.
Yes. Which always pays the bills.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, no, I totally get it. I did not go to school to make toy commercials,
Right.
I wanted to make movies. Here we are. Yeah.
So with that in mind, I said, all right, I enjoy this. I think I'm going to go to school and really study it.
Yeah.
So from New Orleans, came back up here. Went to RISD.
Cool.
Did that.
Yeah.
Moved to New York because of a relationship I was with.
Yeah.
I got out of school. She was still in. Moved to New York. So just to make cash, I assisted commercial photographers.
Okay.
To the point where one guy when I was working with said, John, how long are you going to be an assistant? You should be shooting. And I was shooting for myself. Again, doing my quote unquote art.
Right. It's art, John. We don't need to undersell it. It's art. You look through the lens with an artistic view, and then you're developing the photos. I mean, as someone that shoots primarily digitally now, even though I do have a 35 mil camera that I like to use, and I actually just filled a roll. I take my time. Yeah. Even if it's 36 or 24 exposures, I really take my time. I just filled a roll, and I'm excited to finally get it developed. But
So anyway, I guess this is a rather
it's great
convoluted way of saying. During this time, there was about a 9 or 10 year period where I wasn't even riding.
Not riding at all. Not thinking about bikes.
No, and then a friend of mine got a pretty nice Bianchi, and I said,
"Okay, yeah."
So
that just like Italian sheen on it.
Yeah, so that for whatever reason got me back into biking.
This is while you were in New York?
Living in Brooklyn. Not a lot of places to ride in Brooklyn. Right around Prospect Park. I'd ride in the city occasionally, but not a lot. I really got back into it from Brooklyn. I moved to California.
Okay.
In Marin County.
Yep. So that's San Francisco adjacent.
Just north of over the Golden Gate Bridge.
Over the bridge, yeah.
A lot of really good riding there.
Yeah.
So that's when I really got heavily back into it.
What did you have for a bike then? Did you move with a bike, or did you buy a bike out there?
No, I still had the bike I got in New York, which happened to be a Bianchi.
Yep.
And then going down one of these switchback mountains, I got a flat going into a turn.
Yep.
Which put me into the embankment. I was fine. The bike wasn't.
Yeah.
So then I got there's a builder in Sacramento named Steve Rex.
Okay.
I got one of his bikes.
Yeah. This is a bike that this person built.
Yeah.
How did you find this person?
How did I find about Steve?
Like someone that was like riding in the local scene?
I think partly just from being a bike nerd. And when I, trashed my previous bike, I went to some of the shops in the area.
And you didn't want to buy another Bianchi, or you didn't want to... You were more drawn to, which is interesting, right? We're going to talk about how you build bikes, but you were drawn to this bike builder
because a person built it.
Yes, exactly, right? Right.
That was part of the appeal.
Yeah.
So this one shop I went to had a Steve Rex in my size, and usually, if I understand him correctly, he just builds per customer.
Okay.
So I don't know how they ended up with this one.
Yeah.
But having said that, I got the Steve Rex, and still wasn't working in bike shops at that time.
Yep. This is a steel bike.
Steel bike.
Yep.
Phillip brace. Yeah.
Yep.
And then whatever got the wheels turning in my head, I said, I'd like to know how to do this.
Yeah, yeah.
So I took a class up at UBI, United Bicycle Institute in Ashland, Oregon.
Oh, so how did you drove there?
I drove up there.
A few hours?
Like 4 or 5 hours. Yeah. Where is it? I think it's just south of Portland, if I remember correctly.
Yep.
It was a 2-week class.
Yep.
So I built a lug steel frame.
You built in the 2-week class, you build a frame.
Yeah.
And now, you start. We talk about how you worked at bike shops, but then you had like this period of your life where like art was a big part of your life. So when you approached the bike building, did you approach it from with both parts of your brain? Do you know what I mean? Because building bikes is an art. Bikes are, I think, like a nice bike is beautiful.
I mean, I do appreciate the aesthetics.
Yeah.
But my primary mindset going into it was to the construction and the handling. It had to be a functioning bike, first and foremost.
Right.
The aesthetics. No one likes an ugly bike or an ugly anything. But
well, some people do, but to each their own.
Right. Yeah. But that was not the. I'll just say I didn't approach it as an art.
Sure, you were
I would say more as a craft,
right?
Skill.
The functionality behind it, right. And you were enjoying riding, so you were like, well, how does one make a machine that can do this?
And again, aesthetics were important, but I didn't look at it as art.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
We've previously on the podcast have spoken with a local bike builder who went to RISD that I know he approaches it from both sides.
Yeah.
And I've spoken with him about it. And, you know, there is like a challenge to, right? Like obviously making bikes are hard. Not a lot of people make bikes,
Yeah.
whether they be steel or carbon or whatever, right? But there's very much a part of it that it needs to be, you want it to be aesthetically pleasing, but you also want it to be comfortable to ride.
Well, yeah.
You know,
again,
like, and it depends on what type of bike we're talking about, but like you could put some tubes together that look really pretty and then get on it
would ride,
and it would ride like shit,
Or-
right? Or vice versa,
Yeah.
right? So there is a balance to it.
Yeah, and you know, to your point on aesthetics, I'm working on a bike for someone right now.
Yeah.
I couldn't find the fork crown that I'm making a track bike. I
Oh,
couldn't
cool.
find the specific fork crown I usually use.
Yeah.
I could only find one which, to me, was quite hideous looking.
Uh-huh.
But I had to use it. It was
Yeah.
the only one that could take the fork blades with the correct size steerer tube.
Yeah.
So right now it's undergoing cosmetic surgery. I'm hacking off a bunch of stuff, filling in stuff with brazing. It's going to be filed off, so it's
Yeah.
going to be.
So you're changing the look and the
It'll be drastically different in appearance.
yeah,
so
yeah, right.
you could argue that, you know, that's the art side of it.
Sure.
But,
yeah. Right.
or aesthetic. I don't know. I just think of art as something you hang on your wall.
Oh, okay.
So-
Gotcha.
Yeah. But
Oh, that's okay. I mean, that's just
yeah.
your perspective of art,
Yeah,
right? Like,
yeah, but-
to me, I look at bikes and I mean, you know, if you like the way that your bike looks, that's great. And then if that, you know,
Yeah.
but I think certain bikes look nicer than others.
Yeah,
I
yeah,
don't
and
necessarily put them up there with the Mona Lisa, but
Yeah.
you know, like if I watch like a video on YouTube from like Sea Otter and it's showing this like cool new tech, you know what I mean? Like I've looked at videos of like Bianchis with like some nice like campy super record
Yeah.
on it, you know what I mean? And it all goes together really well. I do have like a bike hanging in my house that I don't ride that is
Yeah.
just like for aesthetic and for
Yeah.
art purposes. You know,
Yeah.
I think about some of the older bikes that are around the shop in that way too, because there's a history behind the bike too.
Yeah.
You know, which I think helps tell the story. And art to me is just like something that invokes thought, right? Or evokes
Yeah,
thought,
okay.
you know? So
Yeah.
I don't know.
And on that note, sometimes I'll see bikes and I'm like, ooh, that's really not great workmanship.
So that's interesting. So you'll look at the workmanship. Is that specifically for like steel bikes or just any bike in general? Because we've sort of
Well,
gone off the rails here in terms of
yeah.
my questions, which is
Yeah,
fine.
right.
But I do have a lot of
Yeah.
questions in that regard, right? So right, that's your journey. You go to
Yeah.
this, you take this 2-week class, you build your first bike, essentially, a steel bike, right, at this 2-week class. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
And has it always been steel bikes since then? Was there ever
Yeah,
like I
yeah.
want to try this? I mean, it's a very different way of manufacturing, whether it be aluminum or any type of alloy or carbon, right? I mean, it's a different way of making a bike.
It's always been steel. I
Yep.
would say, believe it or not, and it probably won't go this way, if I were to tinker with something else, it'd
Yep.
probably be carbon. And
Yeah.
that would be a whole nother rabbit hole.
Right.
So
Right.
I dare say I probably won't go that way.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. But yeah, it's always been steel.
It's always been steel, yeah.
Yeah.
And what draws you to a steel bike? So what like draws you to a steel bike? You ride.
Yeah.
You ride
I'm riding
the
my
bikes that you
bikes,
build,
yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And I mean, it's safe to assume that you like the way that they feel. You like the way that they ride, right?
Yeah.
I mean, you're not necessarily like, what type of riding are you doing on these bikes and why do you keep coming back to it? I mean, as someone that works in a bike shop
Yeah.
and sees all these different types of bikes, carbon, alloy,
Right,
whatever,
right.
like, why steel, you know?
Well, when I got into building,
Yeah.
it was partly because, so when was that? Early mid 2000s.
Yep.
You know, there was definitely carbon. Carbon was just, I guess had pretty much taken over. Maybe not to the extent it has now.
Right. But we're still talking like early Trek OCLV days,
yeah,
right?
Yeah. I think part of it was because I had grown up on steel.
Yeah.
When I was racing, I was on steel bikes.
Yeah.
They were the thing. And then during that period when I was out of bike, that's when the transition happened.
Right.
So I think part of it is I went back into it with where I left off.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, there was also a time, and I think a lot of people might still, well, it is factually true that a steel bike can dent. The top tube of a steel bike can be dented.
I've done it.
Right? And you can still ride the bike.
Yeah.
The bike can be repaired. Now, there are some carbon bikes where, you know, you could have damage to it and it can be repaired, but there's also like, so there's a longevitiness to it. And I think like 20 years ago, if we're talking like early to mid 2000s, right? Early mid aughts, there is carbon's still a little bit scary. You know, there are still people in 2024 that are scared of carbon.
Yeah, I'm not one of them, but
No,
I get your point. I get your point.
And so there's also sort of I'm not trying to like, it's not the same manufacturing process either. It's not like you can just take the knowledge of building a steel bike and be like, I'm just going to do this with carbon.
No.
It's very different. There's similar aesthetic things. There's similar like ways of like using jigs or whatever, right? Like once you have the tubes together. But in order to make a carbon tube is very different than making like a steel down tube, right? So let's focus on steel, right? Like it's the primary material that you use. Is there anything that like specifically inspires your designs? Are there like bike brands that you draw inspiration from? Does it come from that first class that you took? There's at least one of your bikes in the shop here, and I will say that like it feels like a clean looking bike. Yeah. You know, I mean,
I do kind of like clean and minimalism.
Yep. Okay.
Not just with bikes, with everything.
Yep.
So that's
like it's something that you draw inspiration from.
Yeah. Although every once in a while with a paint job, I'll go, like I did one.
Do you paint
bike,
them yourself?
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, that's cool.
I did, this is atypical for me, but one bike I did with splattered head tube and down tube.
Head tube and down tube were splattered.
Yeah. And the rest of it was,
and so you paint them before you put the tubes together or no?
Oh, no.
You're just like masking it off. Okay. Yeah.
But generally minimalist, clean.
Yeah. And this was the person that was going to ride the bike or buy the bike. They wanted it that way, or was this like you were like, I'm going to try something different? Oh, it was one of your bikes.
My bikes.
Oh, cool. And you were like, I'm just going to try something different with this paint job.
Yeah.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, but again, I tend towards the kind of minimal.
Yeah. And like, why steel obviously is still very relevant. Right, there are still steel bikes being made, not just by you, but at big brands like Surly. They still make steel bikes all the time. People love steel bikes. Do you think there's something about it that allows them to be still relevant, like in a world that is dominated by carbon and alloy frames?
This probably doesn't apply to independent builders.
Yeah.
Excuse me, but for this is a relative term for bigger builders like Surly.
Right.
They're not
a huge. Right.
It does enable them to make a good bike less expensive.
Yeah.
There's weight penalties. I'm not going to deny that.
Sure.
But and there's some people, and again, I don't consider myself one of them, that are just like, steel is real, no carbon.
Right.
I think that's just silly, but there are some people who I think just won't ride anything else.
Right.
So I think that's part of why steel is around. And then when you go to the independent builders, I think it's maybe a more refined version of that. People aren't rejecting the other materials, but they just appreciate the craftsmanship.
Right. It doesn't need to be the other ones are bad.
No.
It's just like, this is how I choose to build bikes.
Yeah. Like, I mean, I've ridden a handful of carbon bikes that I really like. If I weren't building my own bikes, maybe I'd be on one of them.
Yeah. So how do you two-part question. How many on average bikes do you make, let's say, in a year? And then how do you source the materials? Like, how much of it is walk me through the process a little bit.
As far as the average, roughly 5, give or take, which is kind of a challenge when you have a full-time job.
Sure. Yeah. Right.
And then other things you want to do and have to do.
Right.
Roughly 5, give or take. And as far as sourcing parts, there's a handful of distributors that I go through.
Yeah. Are there go-to is there like a go-to distributor for a down tube as opposed to a top tube? Is that
Generally, no. Generally, I get all my tubes from
same
one guy. But again, I've got a handful of distributors. If these guys are out,
they don't have something, there's someone else you can get something from.
I try to get, just for simplicity's sake, try to get as much as I can from one distributor.
Yeah.
But if I'm building this bike and this guy has 90% of the parts and this guy's got the other 10 I need, I'll go over there. Yeah.
So someone comes to you and they want to have a bike built for them, essentially, right? Is that how you're doing it? Like it's sort of a per order thing? Yeah. What's sort of like the measuring process like? Like, is there, are you looking at their measurements in order to make a bike, or you're like, okay, I'm going to make you a medium and we're going to fit like the stem to your specific length, the seat tube to your specific length? How does that work?
I try more to fit the frame to their length. And obviously, you've got some adjustability, obviously with seat posts and stem length. But I try to get the frame to their measurements.
Right.
So with that respect, I like to get, if I can, body measurements. Yeah. Overall height, inseam, torso, that stuff. Right. And then also, if I can see them on the bike that they're riding now. Sure. And ask if they have any specific dislikes about it. Right. Use that information.
Right. And so, if say you have two individuals that are 5'10", those bikes could be essentially different bikes, though, depending on like what their comfort level is. Like, are you going to use like a different head tube shape for different people depending on like what type of riding they're trying to do?
Not a different. Well, specifically head tube, since you mentioned that. Not a different head tube shape, but I might do a different head tube length. Give one person a taller head tube. Right. If say they're less flexible.
Sure.
And,
okay.
Things of that nature.
Right. So all of that goes into it. Change the angle. Yeah. Which would also then like change like the slope of the top tube and all of those things essentially.
Yeah. They're all pretty much interrelated.
Yeah. And so are there any tools that you would say are like essential in your workshop? Like what is it a lot of I'm mostly very ignorant to this process, right? Is it a lot of welding? What is it like? Like, what do you do? Like, are you putting on a friggin' welder shield? You know what I mean? Or like, is it braze on? Like, I don't really know the terms.
Yeah, the difference between welding and brazing, which is what I do, brazing.
Okay. Yep.
Welding, you're actually. Let me back up.
Yeah.
Say you're joining two tubes, a head tube and a top tube.
Yep.
Those two tubes, that's the parent metal.
Okay.
So in welding, through the welding rod, you're actually melting those two tubes.
Oh, okay.
You're melting the parent metal and joining them with
together.
The rod.
Right.
With brazing, which is what I do, you don't melt the parent metal. It's actually held together with your brazing rod, which essentially acts as a glue.
So you're adding a material to glue them together as opposed to melting the two materials and having that bind directly.
Right.
Oh, okay.
Right.
All right.
I mean, with welding, you're adding the welding rod as well.
Right.
With again, the main difference is you're in welding melting the two tubes together, whereas in brazing you're
sort of gluing
joining
them
with the third
interesting.
Metal.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so braze-on is like it's sort of like a paint and then like a fire. It's like you do apply heat to it, right?
Oh yeah.
Right.
Yeah, I've got this little burn on my knuckle to show for that.
Is that like a very common occurrence? Like
fortunately, it doesn't happen too often.
Yeah.
But one day I was paying too much attention to the little part I was brazing, and with the still hot rod, I moved.
Yeah.
It wasn't a bad burn. I've never seriously burned myself.
Yeah, sure. Do you specialize in certain types of bikes? You said track bikes. I know you build road bikes. You ride road bikes. Yeah.
My preference is towards road and occasionally track bikes.
Okay.
I recently did a gravel bike for somebody.
Oh, okay. Interesting. Yeah. And so wider clearance for tires.
Right. Bigger clearance, different geometry.
Rim brakes still?
I've done one disc bike.
Yeah.
After I get these two I'm working on done now, I'm going to build another disc bike.
Oh, cool.
That's going to be for me.
Yeah.
Just because all my bikes are rim brake right now.
Yeah.
I was like, I should get a rim brake bike.
Yeah.
But I've done one. one rim, sorry,
One disc.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so, and the gravel bike, did you have to approach it much differently than you would a road bike?
Not really in any significant ways. I mean, there were some things. The guy wanted to run fenders.
Yeah.
Made more clearance, but
Yeah. Are you adding mounting points?
It had a lot more mounting points, yeah, but nothing significantly different. You know,
Yeah.
more mounting points. You put more brazons on.
Right. Right.
Fender clearance when you're designing.
Right.
You design more. So yeah, nothing.
Yeah. It
Nothing,
wasn't drastic.
No, nothing out of my comfort zone.
Right.
I do try sometimes to put myself out of my comfort zone, using myself as a guinea pig.
Yeah. Like when you build a new bike for yourself.
Yeah.
And is that like putting, right? Because manufacturing a bike to mount disc brake calipers is very different than manufacturing a bike. Well, not very different, but it's a different way. Like, are you then having to modify the way the seat stay is like made, or the chain stay in order to like hold those components differently? Like,
yeah, like on the chainstay junction, you'll put in a brace,
right?
But,
okay.
And on forks, generally use heavier blades,
gotcha,
and or a brace.
Yeah.
Although on the disc bike I built last summer, I think it was last summer.
Yeah.
The guy wanted a pre-made carbon fork.
Oh, okay. So he sourced a fork from someone.
Disc specific.
Because forks are a pretty dangerous part of the bike. I don't know how else to say it. There a lot of force is held by your fork, right?
Yeah, you don't want any part to fail, but if the fork fails, that's not going to be pretty.
Right, that's not going to be pretty.
Yeah.
And the way that the force is sort of put on the fork of a bike is different when it's rim brake versus disc brake because of like where the stopping power is happening, right?
Yeah, you've got the fulcrum point down at the axle.
Right. And so it does need to be, that's why you're saying it needs to be like a thicker material essentially to sort of withstand that pressure.
Exactly.
In a different way than like a direct mount rim brake would.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. Oh, interesting. I didn't really think about that. Yeah. But I know some people that do build custom carbon frames, they do end up sourcing forks a good amount from like Rodeo Labs or someone that like makes a fork that like is a solid fork and they just know it's a good go-to.
Yeah. Again, when I do my guinea pig disc brake bike, I'll probably do both. I do that a lot if I'm fooling around making bikes for myself.
Yeah.
I'll make 2 identical frames and change one spec.
Oh, okay.
Even if I know intellectually how, say, a slacker head tube.
Yeah.
It's like, okay, I want to have 2 identical bikes with that one variant just to compare them.
So you literally are like guinea pigging on yourself. It's like you're doing beta testing with yourself.
Yeah. And I figure it's practice building as well.
Right.
So where is it going with that? Oh, when I do the disc, I'll probably do something similar.
Yeah.
Build one with a carbon fork, one with a steel fork.
Yep.
Probably with the same rake and offset on both of them.
Yep.
Just to see
how they feel.
The handling characteristics are different. Yeah.
You've ridden carbon bikes, even if it's just the ones that you're wrenching on at the shop.
Yeah.
Have you ever owned a bike that isn't steel?
No.
No, you haven't.
No.
Interesting.
Again, like I was just talking about comparing a carbon fork to a steel fork.
Yeah.
If I had indispensable income.
Yeah, right. That's another big part of this. This is not a cheap thing to maintain, right? Even if you are selling bikes, it's,
But one thing that's been bumping around in my mind the past handful of years is to get a carbon bike.
Yep.
Build up an identical, as far as geometry goes and components, steel bike. Just to compare them.
I love that. Now,
I know the carbon bike would be lighter.
Yes, right. Yeah, no one's denying that. Yeah. But there is
But they're just ride characteristics will be different.
Right, they'd be different. And I think that's like, have you ridden a steel frame with like a carbon finishing kit? Is that something that you've ever done? Like
finishing it, you mean the components?
Yeah, let's say a seat tube or bar and stem or wheels that are carbon.
Yeah. I mean, basically my bike's not a carbon seat tube.
Yep.
But I've got carbon rims, carbon cranks, carbon seat posts. bar and stem.
Right.
Yeah.
No way are you anti-carbon.
Not at all.
No. It's just like
no.
you build steel bikes, and so that's what you know how to do, and that's what you're refining.
Yeah.
Yeah, as through this process.
Yeah. Again, I'm not opposed to carbon whatsoever.
Yeah, right. We talked about the financial, right? Obviously, you have to pay for these things, and you work at a bike shop too, and so their time is like also valuable to you, right? And like when you're making these bikes, what are the other challenges that you might face as like a small scale builder? Like, is it being able to get the parts that you want? Is it being able to get the clients that you want, to build bikes for?
Yeah. Right now, I would say of those several items you just mentioned, parts are easy to get.
Yeah.
Both frame building parts and the actual components.
Right.
Especially working in a shop.
Right.
Right now, clients is a thing, and I'm at what I call the friends and acquaintance stage.
Sure. Right. Because that's where you want to be with your free time or with your time in general.
Yeah, I mean, I would like it to snowball, and I don't know if I should say this. If I could do it 100% and not have to have two jobs, that would be great. Yeah. But right now it's seems like it's slowly starting to pick up a little bit.
Oh, cool.
And hopefully, as I said, that snowballs. Which will bring its own problems. But
so, obviously you work at the shop here. Are there any are you getting feedback from local cyclists? You mentioned that you do a lot of the feedback testing yourself, right? When someone buys a bike from you, maybe depending on their personality, are you chatting with them down the road, 6 months down the road? How's the bike feel? Are there any pros and cons with the bike? Is there any sort of feedback that you get in that regard?
I've built for how many people? A handful of people. And I've gotten I get feedback.
You get feedback
pretty
from
regularly. Only one of them have I actually refined a frame for.
Okay, what does that entail?
It was actually the first person I built a frame for. Very good friend of mine. And I basically built a new frame.
You did.
Yeah.
Can you take a bike apart and put it back together? Obviously, you can repair steel in a way that you can't repair carbon, but you mentioned building the same exact bike with a different slack of the head tube, right? Can you take the head tube off and readjust that angle? Is that a possibility?
Theoretically, you could, because when people, have I done any frame repairs yet? If I have, they've been very minor, but there's been instances where people have crashed bikes, so folded up the top tube and down tube, and they'll get the whole front end replaced. So during that time, you could say, change the head tube.
Right.
X number of degrees.
Right.
So it is doable.
And the rear triangle is basically unaffected.
At that point. I mean, I haven't done it, but it's doable.
It's doable. Yeah. Interesting. Do you have a favorite build of your own? Is it one of the bikes that you ride? Is it a bike that you've sold to someone else? One that stands out? And why does it stand out?
Good question. Probably... It's either the current. I'm riding 3 bikes that I've built for myself right now. It's either one of my current builds or a frame I built a few years ago. Just like the fit and the ride.
Just the way that it feels.
Yeah.
There must be a very rewarding feeling to have built a bike yourself. I get rewarded when I ride bikes that I didn't even, you know what I mean? When I feel good on a good ride, when you feel good on a good ride on a bike that you made, that also feels good? That's a good feedback loop.
It is. And part of it, it's interesting you should bring that up because, as you do anything for a long period of time, it becomes normal.
Yes. Right.
However, this one of these bikes that I mentioned that I'm riding right now, I was like, this one is just dialed. The first frame I ever built when I went out, I'd be almost like a little kid. I built this. That's kind of...
Ask me about my bike.
That's gone. Not gone, but it's
different.
As with anything, when you're engaged with it for a while, the novelty wears off, and it's probably a deeper appreciation of it.
Right. Yeah. And what about any unusual or memorable requests? Has someone come to you with a request and you're like, oh, I've never done that before. That sounds like an interesting challenge. Or, oh no, I can't do that. Like,
there hasn't been an I can't.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've had one customer who was a little, I don't know if difficult's the right word, but for lack of a better one.
Yeah.
Yeah, no one said, is there anything, has requested anything
unusual.
Yeah.
Right. But people are probably getting specific with certain parts or certain like parts of the process. Like, if someone wants a bike for themselves that you're building, I'm sure they're going to also have input on what type of components they want to put on the bike and all of that.
Yeah.
Right?
But so far that's been pretty straightforward.
Yeah. Oh, cool.
Yeah. There will probably be a day when that happens.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. And, that's part of the learning process.
Yeah.
And if and when it comes, if there's something that is completely out of my ballpark, I've had this happen to me as a customer. Mm-hmm. I'll say, oh, I don't do that. Go see X.
Right.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah.
Right.
But no, I do like the challenge and the growth part of it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So talking about growth, and earlier you talked about hoping that it snowballs. Like where do you see it in 5 to 10 years? Like, are you hoping to manufacture more than the average of 5 a year? Are you happy with 5?
5 is good for a full-time job.
Right.
Also having
while having a full-time job.
Yeah. Right. If it got to the point where I could do that strictly on my own, obviously I'd need to be doing more than 5. That being said, you don't get rich building bike frames,
right.
even if it's your main source of income.
Right.
But
right.
Yeah,
but we're not saying that we need to be rich here.
We all have to work. I'd rather work at something I enjoy that pays my bills than be rich and doing something that doesn't interest me.
Yeah, totally.
So, yeah.
Any advice for like aspiring frame builders, people who want to get into custom steel bikes? Is there like resources that they can look towards? Like, I know there are some other people in Rhode Island specifically that build steel bikes. Like, do you have relationships with them?
One of them, a casual relationship with. Every once in a while, we'll either bump into each other or send each other an email. Hey, what's going on with XYZ?
Yeah.
Yeah, but for beginners, I would say, we just touched on this. Have a very large bank account.
Yep.
Or be independently wealthy.
Right.
But
go work at a bike shop, save a bunch of money.
On a more serious note, I would say take a class or two. That's obviously a very good starting point.
Yeah.
Slowly gather up the tools. Sometimes even at this point, I'll get some scrap metal and practice something if I haven't done it before.
Yep.
Practice your brazing or welding, whatever method you're using.
Yep.
Yeah. And as you just mentioned, if you have other contacts, definitely if you have questions, check with them.
Yep.
Maybe if they have time, they can say, well, here's how we do this and give you a hands-on.
Yeah.
It's probably not likely, but you never know.
Right.
Yeah. So just...
How many hours, can you wrap your head around how many hours it would take to build a frame?
Every so often I time myself.
It must be hard though, because like the more you do it, you become quicker and more efficient at certain parts of the process, right?
Yeah, I haven't timed myself for a while. I believe the last one I did time myself on was about 35, 40 hours.
Oh, wow. Okay.
It could still be better.
Sure.
But part of that's my workspace is very small and cramped.
Yep.
And right now I'm doing all my cutting and mitering the tubes by hand.
Yep.
Hacksaw and file.
Yep.
If I had room, I could get a milling machine, stick the tubes in that, and cut it a lot quicker.
Yeah.
But maybe down the road I'll have more room where I'll be able to do that.
Yeah.
But right now I believe I'm 35 to 40 hours. I might put a clock on the next one I build.
Okay. All right.
Because I haven't done it for a while.
Yeah. Cool.
Yeah.
That's really neat. I mean, I think that we ride, a lot of us, probably people listening to this podcast, they ride bikes a lot. And I don't maybe not necessarily they take for granted the fact that like what they're riding all of these miles or all of these hours like was, you know, made by a person or a series of people. But you don't really think about it in that way. But like there are a lot of like, you know, small scale builders that are passionate about bikes. I think it's really interesting and somewhat like commendable that like you work full time at a bike shop and you're still inspired to make bikes. Like, is there any sort of like burnout that you experience, or do you feel burnout coming and then you try to like take a step back? Because myself, as someone that thinks about bikes a lot and like runs a cycling club, sometimes I'm like, fucking bikes, man, you know, because like they're fun, they're meant to be fun, and they're this like, you know, this like instrument for joy and for fitness, but like sometimes you can like, you know, have too many cards in one or eggs in one basket, you know, and like you want to keep that passion alive because like you said, if you were working full time building bikes, that'd be amazing, right? Yeah. Because you feel good about that, but like how do you keep that passion fresh while also working like, you know, a lot at a bike shop?
Well, that's interesting because I have this running joke about myself when I'm talking with other people. I say, I've become very one-dimensional. I work in a bike shop, I make frames, and I ride.
You ride,
It doesn't leave a lot of extra time.
Sure. But you're happy with that?
I do have other interests. Yeah. I would like to be able to spend more time with them, but I don't know. Maybe it's better to have interests you can't get into rather than having no interest.
Yeah, no, sure.
But to get back to the burnout, I make it a point to take a day or two a week off. Yeah. Both from riding and building. Yeah.
It's like part of your recovery. It's not just a riding thing, but it's also like bikes in general.
I think I've done that with everything I've ever been into because
good balance.
Like when I was doing I joke. Another one of my personal jokes is I'm on the spectrum because when I get into something, I get
you super focused, hyper focused. Yep.
At the same time, I always leave a couple of days a week aside to do something else.
Yeah. That's the beautiful thing about a spectrum. We're all on it. It just depends on how much we're on it or not, you know?
Yeah. But, sometimes I'm like, oh man, I don't want to do this, and I think all of us experience that with everything.
Right.
I'm not obligated to build frames.
Right.
Every once in a while, I'm like, I just don't feel like doing it. And I'll force myself to do it. Yeah. But then again, there's the mandatory days off where I just do something else. Right. And I think that keeps it going for me, whether it's frame building, photography, whatever.
Do you still take photos often?
No. If I had more time, I would. Yeah.
What about photos of the bikes or anything like that? Does that ever?
I do that. Yeah.
You mentioned not being super into commercial photography. Is there a specific type of photography that like calls to you, like street photography, landscape?
Yeah. Well. Yeah. When I first got into photography, I was, as far as looking at other people's work went, I did like street photography. Yeah. And I tried going down that path. I just wasn't good at it. It wasn't my thing. I'm not real good at the, hey, look at that, real quick, bang.
Sure.
I need to, again, suits my personality. Put the camera up on a tripod. Yeah. I used to shoot large format. I eventually, move the camera over a quarter inch that way.
Right. That was waiting for the more right light. You're going to, yeah.
So
let it ruminate a bit.
Yeah. So I went from street photography to kind of, I always had this interest even before photography in old building ruins. Just going in and wandering around.
Yeah, sure.
So I started doing that. Yeah. And I think that's when I first started getting pretty decent at photography as far as composition and photo, what was in the photograph. So for the longest time I would be photographing old abandoned buildings.
Yeah, cool.
Just because I like old buildings.
Yeah.
And then when I moved to the West Coast, I was still doing photography in California. The built landscape wasn't as old, so I didn't find as many interesting buildings.
Right. Very different.
I was still finding stuff, but my focus started to morph. I love the outdoors, hiking, backpacking.
Yeah.
I never liked nature photography.
Okay.
Just didn't interest me.
Yeah.
But then I started saying finding parts of the landscape that had been altered by humans,
Okay.
and started trying to like make a landscape photograph with this blatantly obvious human.
Like element to it.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
did you think of that as like sort of a, like, I don't know, like a commentary on like human
Kind of.
sort of effect on
Yeah.
nature?
Yeah.
Yeah. And how
Yeah,
we can
that was-
sometimes come in and
That was definitely part of it.
be a little bit
Yeah.
too blatant with our, with our freedoms.
That's definitely part of it.
Yeah, interesting.
Yeah,
Yeah.
A lot of those negatives I never printed. They're still in a box.
Yeah.
Yeah, if I ever did have the time.
Do you have a dark room at home? Do you print photos at home?
No. I did. Aside from time, that was one of the reasons
Yeah.
I got out of it. 'Cause
I haven't printed photos myself since high school. It's been
Yeah.
a very long, maybe a little bit in college.
Finding a place where you have a room with plumbing to set aside for
Right.
a dark room,
but, right.
especially when I was living in California.
Yeah,
That was tough.
Yeah.
Yeah, and part of why I got out of it. And
Right.
Part of it was the time thing.
Does digital photography appeal to you at all?
No, and the reason
No.
I'm being hesitant is
No,
I'm not opposed to it.
Sure.
But a really high quality digital photograph
Yeah.
next to a high quality traditional photograph.
Yeah.
I'm not saying one's better. They're different.
They're different. Yeah, for sure.
Oil painting's different than
Right.
acrylic.
Right.
I like them both.
Yeah.
The part of it I don't like is I don't enjoy sitting there clicking a mouse.
Oh, okay. So that,
I like the more hands-on.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
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 which is mostly lost on my generation of photographers.
Yeah. And
Because-
again, I'm not opposed to
No,
it.
but
It's just-
digital editing, has come so much easier. You talk about it's hard to have the space.
Yeah.
Right. And so if you come up having developed your own photos and like doing that sort of like editing on saturation or editing on exposure based on how you're actually printing the
Yeah.
photo, as opposed to me doing it in Lightroom,
Yeah.
then doing it on Lightroom is like, oh, what is this? It's very different, right?
It's different, and again, it's not bad.
Sure.
I just like hands-on.
Yeah, right. That's what you prefer.
Yeah.
What do
I mean,
you-
you can do a lot of amazing stuff on the computer.
Oh yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
But it's very different.
Yeah.
And like even now, like I do try to shoot film, even though I'm much more like conservative with how much film I shoot because it has become expensive to get them printed.
Yeah.
It is still so much fun, and there's something about even my relatively cheap 35 mil Fujifilm camera. The way that it looks is like I love the way that it looks, and when I edit photos digitally, that's the look I'm going for. But
Specifically digital look.
the look I'm going for is more of a Fuji stock
Got it.
that I get from my 35 mil camera, and even then you can't replicate it. Like you said, it's very different. Even if you try to edit something a certain way, I'm a big Fuji fan.
Mm-hmm.
I have an Insta Fuji, I have a 35 mil, and I have my digital camera. But the digital camera that I use, I like try to use like original film stocks from Fuji to like replicate. But like you said, it's different.
Yeah.
But that look there's something to it that like whenever I get those prints from my actual film camera, it's like, oh, nothing beats this.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
And
Even if it's some cheap plastic Fuji, that like a
Right.
friend of mine refurbished from LA. And I was like, I want to use this. And I carry it around with me, and it's so much fun to shoot on, So what one more quick photography question before we get out of here. Do you have cameras at home? Still, like, what is there something that is there a certain system you prefer to shoot on, or does that not matter as much?
It doesn't matter as much right now. I've got I barely even remember a Canon hand-me-down digital camera that I just use for taking pictures of the bikes. But I don't go out and take photographs with it.
Right. You're not taking a Saturday drive to take photos with it. Yeah.
So that's, for better or worse, the extent of my photography.
Yeah, sure.
Right now is just taking pictures of frames and bikes.
Do you think there's anything that we didn't chat about that most people like don't know about building steel bikes? Is there anything else like that you want to share about that process before we get out of here?
Share about the process if people don't know. I think if people are, halfway interested in bikes and steel bikes, they've probably got the basic ideas. Okay, there's a guy with a torch. the finer, more detailed stuff,
Yeah.
you know, they wouldn't know.
Right, of course.
Yeah,
Yeah.
you know, just lining up angles and miters. The miters are the
Right.
cuts where the tubes join.
Right.
You know, heat control so you don't distort or ruin the
Okay.
metal.
Right, right.
Yeah.
Little
No,
things
I think
like that.
We pretty much covered it.
Yeah, we covered the broad strokes.
Yeah.
I don't think anyone's going to walk away from this podcast knowing how to
Go out and
build.
build a bike. Or
Yeah, I
maybe
don't
they
think
will.
so. Will they?
Maybe they'll take a
More
class.
power to you. Yeah.
Maybe they'll take a
Hopefully.
class, which would be cool.
Yeah, which would be really cool.
Yeah.
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 Well, thank you very much, John. Thanks for doing it.
Yeah, thank you,
And
John. It was-
maybe
it was
we'll have
good.
you on again, and we'll like let's showcase some bikes. Let's just do a video of you time lapse. We can time it. See if you can beat your 35-hour mark, and then it'll be a nice little piece. But is there any place that, like, if people are looking to get a steel bike made, how can they reach out to you? Should they come to the shop?
They can contact me here.
Yep.
I've got a Instagram site which has my email on it.
Yep.
It's just Camara Cycles.
Camara.
Yeah.
Cycles.
Yep.
Yeah. Cool.
Yeah.
On Instagram. Come to the shop. We won't give out your email or your phone number or anything. But yeah, people can inquire here or inquire on the Instagram.
Yeah.
Cool.
That'd be great.
All right. Well, thanks a lot,
Appreciate
John.
it. All right,
Appreciate
thank
it.
you, John.
Yep.
Yeah.
Bye. We are It's Just a Hill, a cycling club that promotes inclusion, judgment-free, with no gatekeepers. Focused on creating content from behind the handlebars to in the studio, It's Just a Hill is producing videos and podcasts to spread the message that cycling is for everyone. We are focused on reminding everyone that riding your bike can help you overcome any obstacle, because after all, it's just a hill.
Decaf left, regular right. Decaf left, regular right. It's very challenging work.